to the break, Khadija, we can further explore what kinds of motivations there are, like intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And you also mentioned mindset. That's another hot topic these days. Because a lot of
Definitely.
people say that, oh, I'm not in the right mindset, so I can't do this right now. So let's take a 10-minute salah break and then we'll join you back. So stay tuned. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back. Before going on salah break, we were discussing what causes low mood and how low mood affects our level of motivation to do work. With us today, we have Sister Khudaija Ismail, who is a community engagement worker working for NHS, and she's been working in the field of mental health for the past 8 years. Welcome back, Khudaija.
Thank you.
Right, so let's continue our discussion. Before going on the break, we were talking about how low mood has a direct impact on our level of motivation and how, under these circumstances, students, young people are really finding it challenging to get that motivation to focus on their studies or to complete their tasks. So, yeah.
So I think what we started to touch on was SMART goals, and I think that might be worth going into in a bit more detail. I think is such a useful tool that we can all implement, as adults who are out of education, but also something that we can apply and support our children with, young adults, university students. So some people may have heard of SMART goals before, but SMART goals basically stands for 5 specific things that we can start to link in with our goals of the day. And we'll go through maybe an idea and an example as well at the end. Mm-hmm. So the S as part of SMART stands for specific. So whenever we try and set a goal for ourselves to try and enhance that motivation, we want to ensure it's a very specific goal so we know exactly what it might look like. So rather than it being, at some point today, I'm going to study or I'm going to do some of my assignment, instead we want to know, today I'm going to do 3 hours of study at this time, with these kind of breaks, or I'm going to read 5 chapters today in 5 intervals with these specific breaks, for example. So this is really helpful with effective planning. And obviously, if you compare that to a non-specific goal, where we might think to ourselves, at some point today, I'm going to do some studying, you can already perhaps imagine the difference in our motivation and our drive when we have that plan in place, when we know exactly what's happening for the day and when it's going to happen. And obviously, bearing in mind, this doesn't just have to be for studying. We can apply this in any activity in our life, from studying to our sleep routine to hobbies. Because sometimes the motivation to do pleasurable things isn't there. And obviously, for students, we need a break.
Yeah. So if you could give an example, Khudaija, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, definitely. So if I just go on to the other parts of the SMART goal and then we'll put it all together, I think it'll be really useful to see that. So the next part of the SMART goal is around measurable. So what this means is we want to define how we are going to notice that we have achieved that goal. So this comes back to this idea of having that timing, that I'll have achieved my goal once I complete that 30 minutes of revision. Hence, we're really linking this in with this idea of being specific, because the task is specific, but now so is the duration. I know when I would have completed that task, and hence at the end of that, I'll get that feeling of accomplishment. That's a feeling that maybe we wouldn't necessarily achieve if our goal was to revise for the day. We wouldn't get that accomplishment there. The A stands for attainable. So this is about, can we reasonably attain that specific goal within that time frame? Am I physically able to do that? Do I have the resources to do that? And if we find that actually right now this isn't attainable, perhaps I don't have working Wi-Fi right now to access my resources, we want to then problem solve it and change that goal, because now that goal is finding the books to study from, for example, and then going on to study as part of our SMART goal. The R is for relevant. Does it fit in with our values? Does it fit in with our long-term objectives? So for students, hopefully this will fit in with their objectives, because for anything to do with exams or assignments, it's going to be very, very relevant for them. But if we find there's any other kind of task we're lacking motivation in, and we find, well, it's not that relevant, maybe we're thinking about doing some exercise, but actually I don't enjoy it. I've never really done it before. Therefore, that might not be relevant, but maybe going for a walk is much more relevant. That might be something that person does like to engage in. And lastly, we have the T for time-based. And this is around setting a very realistic time frame, trying to prioritize our tasks and knowing that time frame we will complete that in. So putting this all together, we can create that SMART goal. So you asked for an example before. So this could basically change our goal from tomorrow I'm going to study. Might be something a lot of students say, we're going to revise tomorrow, we're going to finish that assignment. And then on the day, there's not that motivation. We're trying to plow through the day, trying to achieve it, but it will have a lot of barriers. So instead, we want to try and think to ourselves, tomorrow I'm going to study 3 chapters. I'm going to do the first chapter for 20 minutes at 10 a.m. I'm going to do the second one at 11 to 11:20, and let's say the third one at 1 till 1:20. Obviously increasing the time frame where appropriate. And already, because we have a plan, yes, exactly, because we have that plan for the day, when we go to sleep, we're mentally prepared that tomorrow this is what my day will look like, and that can mentally prepare us so much for the day. And similarly, in the morning, when we get up, we'll know what to expect, and we'll think, you know what, even though I really don't feel like doing anything, it's only for 20 minutes. The first chapter I'm starting in an hour, it's only 20 minutes, because we would have set that realistic expectation. So if we know we cannot focus for more than 20 minutes at one time, it would be unrealistic for us to say, I'm revising for 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the evening. So just by making it more realistic, that can help us so much and ensure that we get that motivation, even for that 20 minutes. Because once we do that 20 minutes, we'll feel so much better, we'll feel like we've achieved something, and that will motivate us to do more work that same day.
And I think at the same time, you will get into a habit of getting into a routine. Because if you set that goal for, say, a month, and Islamically they say if you want to develop a new habit or get rid of an old habit, you should do that task for 40 days continuously, and then it will automatically become a habit. Brilliant. Thank you for that, Khudaija. Thank you. I hope our viewers will benefit from this SMART goal approach. And as Khudaija said, it's something we can apply in every single day, in everything we do, not just for students, but even for people who are working from home. They can even apply this for achieving their goals and tasks. So, Khudaija, talking about motivation, what are the types of motivation? What is intrinsic or extrinsic motivation?
So I think a really key thing is with intrinsic motivation, we're thinking about where that motivation comes from within us, the actual feeling of motivation. And one of the common approaches we take within kind of therapy is we look at things from an inside out perspective. When we're trying to get motivated, we're very driven by how we're feeling, but we want to take into account that how we're feeling may be tired and not motivated. So obviously this has an impact on how we're feeling. So this is where we want to try and reverse this, and we want to let the external affect the internal. So here we obviously have the extrinsic motivation, things like doing the SMART goals, for example, that once we've done a task, we'll feel motivated, we'll want to do a little bit more, and that will affect how we feel internally, and therefore that intrinsic motivation comes back out. And I think a lot of people do usually think that when we try and do something, it's still incredibly hard. How do we change how we're feeling within us when we can't get motivated to do the activity? And there's a really good technique we can all use, and this is something as simple called the 5-minute rule. And this is purely, we've planned today, we've got these 20-minute slots booked in, for example, for our revision, but we still can't get motivated. So we think of this 5-minute rule, where we start doing something, even if it's just for 5 minutes, because if we're feeling quite low, if we're feeling negative, trying to do something for 5 minutes may be the most realistic thing we can try within what we're feeling. But what we'll notice is after that 5 minutes, we'll either complete the 5 minutes and feel great that we've done something rather than nothing, or we'll start to feel more intrinsically motivated to do more. So either way, we can't really lose with that 5-minute rule. So it's a really key one to start using.
That sounds fantastic. And we have received a question from one of the audiences, and she's saying that I'm a university student and currently pursuing my master's. But what I'm struggling with most is that even if I try to motivate myself and I set a time or a schedule to do work, I start procrastination and I don't know how to
Mm.
get out of it.
So that's a really good question, because procrastination is so common with all of us,
Yeah.
but obviously in particular with anyone who is studying. So for that, I would still recommend that 5-minute rule, but I'd also suggest that it's always useful to create almost a baseline diary, to think what we do during our day, whether we planned our revision and we didn't do it, but looking at our day and reflecting, what did that look like? And we can always think about, was my day balanced? Did I have things that were enjoyable? So maybe my hobbies, things I enjoyed. Did I have my routine activities, like waking up at a certain time, eating perhaps? And did I have those necessary activities in my week as well? So things like assignments, doing that uni work. Because a lot of the time with university students, they get so overwhelmed with university work,
Yeah.
it takes such a huge priority that we forget about this aspect of self-care and having a balance in our day. Because if we saw a friend was focusing completely on their university work, wasn't doing anything for themselves, we might straight away recognize, well, actually, you need some time out. You need to do something you enjoy. We haven't spoke to you in ages. You need to be a little bit more social and, start to improve how you're feeling that way. So if we can notice by doing a baseline diary that my balance isn't quite there, then this is something that we want to actively make changes and use this idea of SMART goals, not only for our university work, but to ensure we have elements of self-care, whatever that might look like, but also to ensure we have those pleasurable activities and make sure there's a general routine. So we're feeling good about ourselves in whatever other ways we can by doing these enjoyable things, by doing these hobbies. And that will also allow us to feel more motivated to study when our week is not taken over by this huge schedule of just studying all the time. We need a break and we need to prioritize ourselves as well.
I'm glad you mentioned self-care because often we neglect that, especially for people who are working round the clock or people who are frontline workers. When they come home, they're exhausted, they're tired. But instead of focusing on themselves to look after themselves physically and mentally, they start utilizing that time when they're at home to do other tasks around the home, household chores or responsibilities around family. And then in the end of the day, there's no time left for self-care, and that doesn't help at all. That contributes towards more burnout and more exhaustion. So what advice would you like to give to these people?
So I think for these individuals, and this is also really common for parents, because again, working from home right now, having to do the household work and, doing all these other things take priority. And the common thing we hear at different therapy services is, well, I don't have time for myself. I can't actually fit in that self-care. And I think the first step of trying to implement self-care is knowing all of our options of what we can do to look after ourselves. So what does that look like for everyone as an individual? And know all these different ideas now. Because if we are feeling stressed or overwhelmed and we think, I need to do some self-care, it's very hard in that state of mind to think, well, I could do A, B, or C. We can't think that clearly when we're stressed and overwhelmed. We need a prompt. So that list can be the first prompt if we have that in front of us. By exploring all the different ideas, not just thinking about, running or walking, but the little things, watching a bit of TV, doing X, Y, and Z. Every little option we want to exhaust. So we have a huge list of different activities, things that take different amounts of energy, things that take different amounts of time. Once we have that list, it's about thinking about our day to day and starting small. So instead of thinking self-care has to take an hour or, has to take ages, self-care can take something as small as 2 to 5 minutes. Because as I say, something is always better than nothing. And we do need to be prioritizing ourselves. And we can also look at this idea of SMART goals for self-care as well. Another huge thing with students when it comes to self-care is this guilt factor, that they feel guilty if there are other things when there's so much work to be done. So common. I think we can all be guilty of this coming out of education. And the same thing applies here, because When we feel guilty, there's this unpleasant emotion, this unpleasant feeling, and we want to try and increase our tolerance to this feeling. So at the start, doing something that we enjoy, let's say watching TV for a little while, might cause us this very unsettling feeling. But if we're only doing that for 5 minutes, and we do that every day because we know it's relaxing, we know the benefits will outweigh the cons of doing this, after a few weeks, that feeling will hopefully decrease in intensity. It'll be a lot easier to manage. We're increasing our tolerance, and then over time, we can increase the amount of time we spend doing self-care. As I say, it doesn't have to take a long time. It can take 5 minutes. But there's also this aspect of mindfulness that we can maybe implement, relaxation, breathing techniques that can be done while we're doing other things. We can be doing mindful activity where we just focus on being completely present when we're doing a specific task around the house. So we're not necessarily taking time out of our routine if we feel it just cannot happen. We're kind of incorporating the aspect of self-care with another activity, which can also be really helpful for us.
You mentioned two important points, Khudaija, and I'm really pleased you mentioned that. One is guilt. I've spoken to a few people recently, and they are struggling with a lot of things that's happening all at once in life. And I asked them this key question: what you do for self-care? And the response was nothing much. And I tried to explain it to them that self-care is so important, because if you don't invest in your own self, if you don't look after your mind, your body will automatically start showing signs of exhaustion and tiredness and fatigue and rest of it. Because when you're psychologically stressed and anxious, your body starts showing symptoms that you're stressed out. It affects your health overall and your well-being. So some people say that, oh, if we take the time out for ourselves, then I feel guilty because I could have been doing something else during that time, like some household chore or doing something for someone else. But I think people need to understand that if you are not able to look after yourself, if you're not looking after your mind and your body, then you won't be in a position to look after someone else. So if you could elaborate on that, please.
Yeah, definitely. And there's just an analogy I can bring up here, which hopefully will be able to demonstrate this really clearly, that with self-care, it's actually called the jug of juice analogy, where we want to imagine we are this jug of juice. And if we imagine that that juice level is to do with our energy, how we're looking after ourselves, the more energy we have, the more juice we have to put into however many glasses we want it to go in, because there'll be more juice available to those glasses. So in the same way, if we're looking after ourselves, if we have that self-care management, in our day-to-day routine, we'll feel more positive, we'll feel more energetic, our days will feel more balanced, and therefore, as you say, 100% we will be better equipped to look after our studies, to look after our children, for example, whatever it might be. And I think it's about remembering the benefits of self-care are so great. They do so much for us that hopefully we will slowly start to remember that it does outweigh those cons. And, as I mentioned around this intolerance of this guilt, once we build that up and we have more tolerance for it, it will become that much easier to implement self-care. And then hopefully we'll start to actively learn that, yeah, I did something for myself. I didn't finish X, Y, and Z, but you know what? I feel so good. I'm definitely going to finish that tomorrow. I've got so much time, and we will feel generally a lot better and therefore more equipped to actually manage the other demands in our life as well.
So we discussed how low mood can affect our level of motivation. What about anxiety? Does that cause lack of motivation as well?
I think up to a point, definitely, because if we think about the symptoms of low mood and depression, where a lot of it is around tiredness, it's around not really wanting to do things, it's about withdrawing. Once we don't have many activities going on and we're not doing as much as we used to, we have a lot more time to be thinking. And as we can maybe all relate to, the more time we have to think, sometimes we can be more prone to negative thoughts, to different worries, and that in itself can cause anxiety. Now, once we feel that anxiety, as you mentioned earlier, we can feel this within our body. We can feel our heart pounding when we're anxious, we feel sweaty, we feel sick, we shake, all these different symptoms. Now, that in itself can make us feel, I just don't feel well enough. I don't feel right within myself. And once we get lost in that cycle, we're worrying too much. Because we're worrying so much, we feel low, we feel negative. Because we feel low and negative, we withdraw even more. We have even less motivation. We engage in even less activities. Therefore, now we are feeling more anxious. We have more time to worry. And it literally goes into this never-ending cycle. So I think the links between low mood and anxiety are definitely there. And there is a huge link there with motivation, which is why that starting point should always be with what we're doing. Because we can change our behaviors. We can change what we're doing by using all of these techniques. But actually, it's a lot harder to change our mindset. So we always want to try and start with those behaviors. That's always the primary step.
So, what are some common ways that people can, or techniques that people can apply in their daily life to regain their motivation to do work?
So I think just starting off, just kind of summarizing, I guess, some of the things that we've already covered, it comes down to this idea of planning, trying to be setting our own goals. And obviously, as we've looked at SMART goals as well, and trying to alleviate these kind of barriers that we notice. So it's about looking at ourselves, reflecting on our own normal traits and behaviors, and thinking what normally stops me from being motivated to do these specific activities. Once we notice what those barriers are, we can hopefully actively try and problem solve them and slowly come back to the stage where we have this normal level of motivation, whatever that might look like.
Mhm. And what are the ways we can improve our mood? I mean, you mentioned mindfulness, and if you could just elaborate on that so people can kind of find the time to meditate or just be present in the moment to find that calm and, relaxed moment for themselves.
Definitely. So for anyone who isn't familiar with this term of mindfulness, what it really means, it's about being present in our day-to-day life. And this is something that is such a key part of what we should be doing. If we think on a daily basis, when we do any automatic activity, whether this is going for a walk somewhere familiar, whether this is washing the dishes, tidying up, we can do these things without necessarily thinking actively about doing them. It's very automatic behavior. And when this happens, we can get very much lost in our thoughts, whether these are worries, negative thoughts, etc. So being mindful is actually trying to be completely present in our current day-to-day life. So this is extremely important for anyone who feels that, they can't fit in self-care, because we can actually link these things together where we be mindful doing specific activities. There's a really common technique we can use to be more mindful, and it's called the 5-4-3-2-1 technique. What this looks like is, let's say, perhaps before bed. Maybe that's a time where we overthink. And what we can do is we just want to look around, use our senses, and we want to describe to ourselves 5 things we can see. And we want to explain those things to ourselves in great detail, because we can't think of describing those things and our worries or our anxieties at the same time. It's going to be one or the other. So once we've listed those 5 things we can see, we then go to 4 things we can hear. Again, we want to just really focus on being present. What is going on around us right now? And we continue with this technique with the rest of our senses. So obviously 3 things that we can smell, perhaps, things we can taste, something we can touch, etc. So we're trying to change our focus to be actively present in the day-to-day. And as I mentioned earlier about mindful activity, we can incorporate this 5-4-3-2-1 technique into our day-to-day activities. Let's say, for example, washing dishes. Usually it's something we just do. Maybe we don't want to do it. It's quite tedious. But actually, instead of doing it as an automatic behavior, while we're doing that task, let's actively think about the plate we're holding. How heavy is it? How is the water pressure? Is it quite hot water? Is it cold water? How does the soap feel? What color is the soap? What brand is it? How many plates do I have? All these different aspects that we can think about, as simple as something like washing dishes, we can actually make into a mindful activity, because there's so many things to consider with our senses when doing these kind of activities. So it's something to even try at home for anyone viewing today, and just see if you can be mindful. While you're washing the dishes, be actively present and think about all your senses at this time, and you will see that afterwards, we're not sort of caught up in those worries or thoughts. We've actually had a nice break, even if it is for 2 minutes. That's still better than being lost in our thoughts for the majority of our day.
I think a lot of people, they find it really difficult to stay focused on one thing because they say that there are thousands and thousands of thoughts crossing their mind in the present moment. So they find it very hard to kind of stay focused on just one thing. But Alhamdulillah, we are blessed to have Salah 5 times a day. And I think that's a
Mm.
beautiful way of staying focused in the present and not thinking about anything else, not thinking about anything around us, but just being present in the moment. And that's a very good exercise if people do
Mm.
it properly, that is.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
and I think just to touch on this point that you've made about Salah and Namaz, I think this is something, again, it's an automatic activity a lot of the time. You know, we know what we're doing, we know it quite well, so we kind of perform these actions, but actually instead try and be completely present while doing our Namaz, while we're reciting these verses, while we're going into sajda, trying to actively know that this is what we're doing and come away from these other thoughts that might come in our head. But I think it's also about normalizing that it is common that we'll get these worries or stresses come into our mind. At times we don't want them to come in. If we're feeling a certain way, we are feeling that way. But it's about acknowledging those thoughts, knowing they're there, but then refocusing on the task at hand, whether that is namaz or something else. So it's just about knowing they're there, let the thought be, but just don't pay any attention to it, and then reflect on what you're actively doing at the time as well.
Is there any way we can channelize our thoughts? For example, people who are already struggling from mild depression or some other mental health difficulty, for them it's already quite hard to do things, do tasks on a daily basis. And then on top of that, you have this lockdown and social distancing that just causes even more, difficulty for such people. What can they do to help themselves?
So I think, as we've touched on briefly, it's about starting small. But if we are struggling with negative thoughts or worries, and actually it is taking over to a stage where we are unable to get that motivation and do the activity, I think the first step is about acknowledging what those thoughts are. So a really common therapeutic technique we look at is about noting these thoughts down and thinking, what are these thoughts? You know, can I do anything about these? Or actually, is it something I have no power over? But I think that initial step is the reflection to know that this is my theme of worries, this is the thing of concern, and that in itself will allow us to look at those concerns and see if we can problem solve. So I guess it's kind of thinking that there's two approaches really, that we either look at the behaviors and what we're doing, or we can start to investigate our thoughts further, but also try and challenge those thoughts, you know, thinking, how much do I believe this thought? You know, is there evidence to support this negative thought I'm having? Or is it my own perception? And it's trying to look at these various questions to try and challenge and tackle that thought. Because when we are feeling low or depressed, we are more prone to those negative thoughts. And we can get to the stage where we feel we do truly believe it. But it's about asking ourselves that question, that do I truly believe this is true based on evidence? And a lot of the time we'll start to recognize it is mainly our perception rather than a factual piece of information.
Are there any exercises or relaxation techniques that people can do with their children or engage their children? Because a lot of mothers, they say that we would love to have some time for ourselves to just calm and, calm down and relax. But because we have so many responsibilities, we have younger children, toddlers, it's very hard to get that me time. So is there any activity where mothers can involve their children or their toddlers as well and, enjoy that
Yeah,
moment?
yeah, definitely. You know, even this aspect of mindfulness, there are so many different ways to obviously encourage our child to participate in this. I think it's about finding the resources. There's so much available online, and then hopefully doing that activity with the young person or our child, whoever it might be. But also in terms of relaxation, having a specific breathing technique video on while you're with your child, so you can both follow, you can kind of support your child to do it with you and explain to them. There's so many different resources that do cater to different ages and different groups of people. So first of all, it is about finding those resources. But even if it comes to just doing a very simple breathing technique with your child and talking them through it, I'll give you an example. There's a common breathing technique called the 4-2-6 breathing technique, where all it is, you're breathing in for 4 seconds and counting that with your child, holding it for 2 seconds, and then breathing out for 6. We can surely encourage our children to do that with us and have that as a practice, even if it's just for a couple of minutes a day. So I think there's definitely so much scope to practice mindfulness, and there's so many benefits of mindfulness that I think it's definitely one to encourage our children to do as well.
Yes, especially where families are living in flats or small households where there's no garden and it's difficult for people to go out and about. I think you have to find something to do within the four walls of your house to keep yourself
Definitely.
engaged and motivated. Um, we've received another question from a student. She's saying that because she has to do a lot of work online, and
Mm.
often when she's meant to do research work, she ends up looking at documentaries or videos on YouTube. And by the time she realizes it, she has spent a few hours and she loses track
Mm.
of time. So, any
Mm.
advice you would like to give her?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. It's about maintaining our own boundaries of what we want to achieve within the day, but also trying to seek that support from whoever we live with, if there is anyone, to try and prompt us. We can even use our phones as digital prompts, put in an alarm that, I need to make sure I refocus after this amount of time. But there's also a few websites online where if you enter it in, it basically will block your access to other websites for that specific amount of time. So you
That's
know that
interesting.
even if you want to access anything else, you have to wait till that timer is up. I can't remember the name at the moment, but it's worth looking into because I think maintaining those boundaries, being at home, that structure, as we said, it's not there, is it? We can work in the morning, in the night, in the middle of the night. We can do our work whenever. Whereas if we're at university, we will have that specific time set for lectures. We'd have our seminars, whatever it might be. So if we do feel that we are procrastinating, we are losing track of time, it is making those very proactive attempts to recognize, first of all, I know I'm doing it. Therefore, I need to ensure I set some alarms on my phone, however that might
Mm,
be, or I need to find my family member or a friend to call me, maybe even doing some joint working virtually, because sometimes it's so
yes.
motivating to be with someone else. So
Mm,
organizing those half-hour bursts of revision time or assignment time with someone else. It doesn't have to be a
yes.
conversation. Having someone there in itself can be so motivating. And then that can
It's just
also
like we
act
do
as a,
group studies.
yeah, definitely. It's just so helpful because if we have that prompt and, if we're working through something and we start to procrastinate, but then whoever's online with us is saying, oh, have you looked at this? We will suddenly snap
Mm,
back to the work and think, oh, yeah, it's been 10 minutes. We just haven't focused. And then we'll
mm,
slowly recognize it more and more, recognize when we're doing it. And once we have that awareness, we will slowly be better prepared to bring ourselves back to the focus of attention, which should obviously be the uni work that we want to complete. So it's using whatever resources we can find.
no, that is definitely helpful because I personally apply it, especially because I'm
Mm.
working from home. So I would ask one of my work colleagues to just stay on video call, and then we work on the projects together. So we're not in the office, but still we have that kind of feeling of someone is there working alongside on the same thing, and that gives a
Yeah.
boost of motivation because when you're working on your own in home environment, it's really hard, especially with all the
100%.
distractions around. Like if a child is playing outside, that can be distracting, or the sound of some
Definitely.
construction work going on. So it's hard to work from home, to study from
Yeah.
home. Libraries are closed. People can't even access, places that are noise free. So it's hard. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, one last thing I wanted to ask you, Khatija, because you're quite passionate about this. Yeah, we have a lot of stigma around
Mm.
mental health in our community, and one of the main goals of having this program on Hidayat TV is to break that stigma. Yeah, to get rid of
Mm.
that stereotype that most people have around mental health, because as soon as you hear the word mental health,
Yeah.
people automatically assume that there is something wrong with you, like you're not stable mentally or you're definitely suffering from some psychological disorder, although that is not the case. If you could please explain that, what mental health really means and how we can break
Mm.
that stigma.
Definitely, because I think a lot of people do mix up this idea, as you said, mental health means something mental, something not right. But if we think of it, instead of it being mental health, let's think of it as mental well-being, where we will all have difficulties with our well-being. We will all have times where we display symptoms of depression. Will we ever have found someone who hasn't ever felt low or hasn't ever felt that they're not motivated? More than likely, everyone has at some point. But just because we have this label of a mental illness, if someone is diagnosed with depression, as you say, there's a huge amount of stigma that is wrong with them. They need to maybe come back to their faith and recite dua or do whatever it might be. But actually, we will all have went through something like this or symptoms of at some point in our life. Even something like anxiety. We've all worried about something or the other at some point in our life.
Yeah.
And one symptom of anxiety is worrying. We've all felt nervous about a job interview or going to university.
Yeah.
We might feel sick, our heart's pounding when we're thinking about it. That's symptoms of anxiety. We're not diagnosing with anxiety, but I just want to reiterate how normal it is to have symptoms of mental health without it being a stigmatized mental health problem as such, because it's all about looking at our symptoms, recognizing it, and also, as you say, normalizing it within our community, because we want to ensure that everyone feels open to accessing support if they need it, rather than keeping things to themselves, rather than feeling that they're embarrassed of what they're feeling. We want to encourage everyone to open up so we can actually help them support those people and get that support they need before it becomes such a huge problem. Because when we start off feeling low, it starts small, it gradually comes up on us. But the more we engage in these negative behaviors and we start thinking negatively, the problem can really build up. And actually, if we can nip it in the bud, if we can be able to share those thoughts with someone and support someone, it can make a massive, massive difference.
And I think when you talk about supporting each other, it can do wonders. Just like you gave an example that at the moment we're unable to have group study sessions at home with friends or classmates, or we can't work in office environment. I mean, for some people, but just being there, even virtually, means a lot, right? And it really
Definitely.
does help each other in motivating. I mean, if I can motivate someone else, someone can motivate me, and even people who are experiencing low mood. And I have heard from many sisters who are saying that they are having crying spells and they're finding it really challenging because they're away from families, they're living in hostels or university accommodations, and they find it really difficult to stay focused because it can get depressing being confined
Definitely.
to just one room in the university hostel. So definitely, I agree that you can motivate each other, be there virtually. You can make a phone call or just have like video call and do work together. Any last final message you would like to give our audience?
I think just a final note is that know that you're not alone. If you are struggling with any kind of symptoms of mental health, any difficulties with your well-being during this pandemic, it's completely normal. It's so common. It's just about seeing if we can improve how we're feeling, and if we can't, it's about accessing that support. For the university students who are perhaps watching, there will be services available at your university, so do have a look into it, because we need to make that first step. If we can't help ourselves just by ourselves, get that social support, try and look for our friends who can maybe help, but otherwise do gain that extra support. There's nothing wrong in doing that for us, so I definitely encourage everyone to do that.
And there are lots of helplines available for especially the Muslim community, for youngsters, for students, and they can easily contact them if they are finding anything which is difficult to talk about or if they are struggling with their own emotions. Do you have any suggestions, Khudaija, that you would like to give?
Yeah, I
Any
think obviously
organizations that can help?
we've got places like Inspirited Minds, which is a mental health charity that provides various different types of support, which does take an Islamic point of view, so faith-based counselling and things like that. But there's also places like Muslim Youth Helpline, so that can also be found online, where you can just call up and speak about how you're feeling, and you hopefully will be answered in a non-judgmental manner and hopefully feel comfortable speaking. And sometimes that is the main thing that is needed. So they're the main two that I'm aware of. I don't know if you've got any other ones you want to add to that.
Well, I think you have covered, mashallah, almost everything. And thank you so much for the valuable insight that you shared with our audience today. I'm sure people must have found it really insightful and they will apply these techniques in their daily life to make things easier. Once again, Khudaija, Jazakumullah khairan for today.
Thank you for having me today.
Absolute pleasure. Inshallah, we'll meet you next time, next Saturday at 12 p.m. with another brilliant topic. And till then, look after yourselves and your mental health. Assalamu alaikum.